Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Josh Tylerbaum, the Associate Dean for Research and Academic Programs here at the Law Center. On behalf of Dean Traynor, who regrettably can't be here today due to family exigency, I'd like to welcome you to the 2017 Thomas F. Ryan Lecture. So just a few words about the lecture, and then I will introduce our speaker, Rick Brooks. So Thomas Ryan received his bachelor degree from Georgetown College in 1971 and his JD from the Law Center in 1976. Mr. Ryan passed away young, and at the time of his death, he was serving as a law clerk to Judge John Lewis Smith, Jr. of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. He's survived by his wife, Christine, and two children, Tom and Missy, and we're honored and delighted that Christine and Missy and her fiance are going to be here with us today. The lecture series was established in Thomas Ryan's memory by Hugh Grant, a longtime benefactor of Georgetown University. And the Ryan Lecture has become a signature jewel of the Law Center. For well over 3 decades, we've brought an extraordinary group of leading academics and public servants here to talk about their work in a wide range of incredibly important subjects. The event started in 1985 with an inaugural lecture from then Senator Joseph Biden, bringing us up to just last year when we heard from George Akerlof, a Nobel Prize laureate in economics, who's a member of the faculty at Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy. The Ryan Lecture series is an essential fixture in our academic calendar and is a wonderful tribute to a remarkable young man, Thomas Ryan. And we're delighted that another luminary, Professor Richard Brooks, is going to speak to us today. And now, let me turn to introducing our speaker. So it's truly an honor and a pleasure to introduce the 2017 Ryan Lecturer, Richard R.W. Brooks, the Charles Keller Beekman Professor of Law at Columbia University. Professor Brooks is a world-renowned legal scholar with expertise in contracts, law and economics, and racial justice. He's written numerous articles and books on a wide array of topics, including contract law and theory, experimental economics, the economics of environmental law, fairness, and perceptions of the legal system. While his scholarship primarily focuses on contracts and agency, I think his scholarly project can be described more broadly as the analysis of human behavior through the lens of economics, custom, and law. Professor Brooks' most recent book, Saving the Neighborhood, Racially Restrictive Covenants, Law, and Social Norms, co-authored with Carol Rose and published by Harvard University Press, examines the history and enduring legacy of racially restrictive real property covenants in the United States. The book describes how racial covenants, despite their repudiation by the Supreme Court in 1948, have lived on in real estate records, providing signals that continue to influence the behavior of lenders, insurers, and realtors, as well as the beliefs and expectations of home buyers and sellers. Robert Gordon, a preeminent legal historian at Stanford, calls Saving the Neighborhood a brilliant and disturbing history of how racial restrictions designed to keep black homeowners out of white neighborhoods became legally respectable and socially pervasive, and a powerful and subtle mediation on the interplay between law, violence, and social norms. Professor Brooks has had an illustrious academic career. He holds a bachelor's degree from Cornell University, a JD from the University of Chicago Law School, and a PhD in economics from the University of California at Berkeley. He started his academic career in the Department of Policy Analysis and Management at Cornell, and before joining the faculty at Columbia Law School in 2013, he taught at Northwestern University School of Law and at Yale Law School, where he was the Leighton Homer Surbeck Professor of Law. Professor Brooks has served as a visiting researcher at the Center in Law, Economics, and Organization at the University of Southern California Law School, on an advisory committee to the Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences Division of the National Science Foundation, and as a research specialist in the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice. He currently serves as an advisor on the American Law Institute's Restatement of the Law Fourth Property Project. And each summer he spends 6 weeks in Paris teaching in the summer school in law and economics co-sponsored by Yale, Paris 2, and ESSCC Business School. The academic life is tough. But please join me in welcoming the 2017 Ryan Lecturer, Professor Richard Brooks.
Thank you. That was a very kind introduction. I'm honored to be here today and humbled to speak in this conference, not merely because of the number of distinguished scholars that have spoken before me, but to take part in honoring Thomas Ryan. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'll just jump right in. I've tried to limit the amount of time I'll lecture to 45 minutes, but if I go over, I trust Josh will give me a nod. I want to talk today about, I want to see if I can make an argument in favor of political correctness. It seems to me so much the victim of assailment that you would imagine that there was never any basis for politically correct speech. And I'm going to try to connect it in the long run to contract law. One of my favorite contract law scholars and pieces by Lon Fuller on consideration, the consideration doctrine and form. And in the context of doing all of this, I hope to relate it to a number of important campus-wide controversies, as well as controversies that are going on throughout the country. That political correctness, consideration, and forms might actually serve a useful function. I recognize that this is a provocative claim, at least in some sense. So I genuinely encourage you to push back and help me to refine the views. But I think there may be something here, both in form and in substance. I want to begin with just a short quote from Lon Fuller, 1941 article in the Columbia Law Review on consideration and form. One who wishes to communicate his thoughts to others must force the raw material of meaning into defined and recognizable channels. He must reduce the fleeting entities of wordless thoughts to patterns of conventional speech. Just as the use of language contains danger for the uninitiated, so legal forms are safe only when used in the hands of those familiar with their effects. So I'm going to begin with, and I should just mention, the consideration doctrine for those of you who are not contracts people or who have forgotten it. It's just a particular form that makes valid and makes legally enforceable a promise. It took the place of a seal, for instance. It was just a simple stamp, a piece of wax that makes an ordinary promise enforceable in law. It's just a form, just a simple form. And I want to begin and spend most of my time today talking about simple forms. And I'm going to begin with the simplest form that I can imagine, the way we address each other. I don't want to imagine how we talk to each other. That's much more complicated. Long, meaningful, politically charged, emotionally charged conversations. I think that's very hard to analyze. But what if we just bored down and looked at something very simple, just how we address each other in very basic ways. So that's going to be my where I'll start. So address here, the way I'll use it, is a verbal form of referring to persons or parties to whom one is speaking. Formally defined, the way academic linguistics linguists, would define it, would be sort of a linguistic marker used by speakers regarding their colloquators. Just a linguistic marker used by speakers regarding their colloquators. Conventional ways of giving voice to this reference are called forms of address. There are many forms. First names are common in full, for example, Margaret, Leonard, Charles, as well as in diminutive forms, Moll, Leo, or Charlie. You also have nicknames, Foxy, Bones, Yardy. Nicknames may be flattering, but may also be pejorative, as illustrated in our most recent presidential campaign. They often characterize some behavioral or physical aspect of the individual or an occupational status. For instance, Bones, a shorthand for sawbones or slang for physician or surgeon. Last names or surnames are also common, occasionally said alone, but more often used with a honorific or an occupational title, such as Miss Flanders, or Dr. McCoy, or Professor Kingsfield, or just the titles, ma'am, Mr., professor. Generic names, Sheila, Mac, Jack, are sometimes invoked when personal names are unknown or otherwise unavailing, as are common descriptors, lady, officer, fellow, which are not necessarily descriptively accurate, but used frequently. Kinship terms reflecting actual familial relationships, mother, son, uncle, as well as fictive bonds, sister, brother, pops, are used widely across some communities, especially in moments of heightened trust or intimacy. Closely related are life stage terms, child, babe, old man, used without any fealty to age or biology, and more general terms of endearment, my dear, buddy, sweetheart, as well as the other end of the spectrum. We have terms of scorn and ridicule, whore, quack, son of a bitch. That's from The Paper Chase. Occasionally appropriated as endearments between the familiars or as signs of respect in some contexts. Although terms of endearment and scorn may be highly creative, and in some sense are most effective when inventive, I'm going to focus on those banal forms, those forms that have broad-based understandings. Those are the forms of address and reference, and they're issued for various reasons. Through address, parties can establish or acknowledge relationships. They can indicate status or circumstance. They can create distance, and they may close distance. Address indicating deference is most evident in non-reciprocal forms and asymmetrical forms of address, when interlocutors exchange different and dissimilar addresses. For instance, a doorman may greet a resident with, "Good evening, sir," and receive in response a first name or a nickname address, if that, maybe just even a nod. Patients address their physicians as doctor plus last names. Law students and college students call their teachers professor plus last names. Employees call their employers Mr. or Mrs. plus last names, while patients, students, and employees themselves often are addressed without title, by first name or other. Traditional roles and status distinctions are preserved by these forms where they're observed. However, we're told increasingly that tradition is giving way to more reciprocal and less formal symmetrical forms of address across more and more hierarchical encounters. Nowadays, professors and graduate students exchange first names, as do employers with their employees, who tend to echo the address they receive from coworkers and supervisors, resulting in a great deal of address symmetry in the workplace. At home, telemarketers call and, without asking, use first names on the first instance. Receptionists, repairmen, shop clerks, agents of common carriers and public accommodations, all give as good as they get and no better, because according to the common complaint, people are way too sensitive these days. No sphere seems unaffected by the weight of our language, leveling down, bearing down on traditional forms. Tradition is under siege, critics warn, and even time-honored ancient forms of polite address are not immune, they claim, from the enfeebling sensitivities of contemporary societies. Late in the summer of 2015, 1 week before the freshmen arrived on campus, Stephen Davis, a professor of religion at Yale and head of one of its residential colleges, asked students, faculty, and staff to no longer call him master. The title and address long reserved for college heads at Oxford and Cambridge, and more recently imported for college resident heads at Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. Davis invited those who would address him formally to use doctor, professor, or simply head of college instead. Pointing to deeply problematic racial and gender aspects of the so-called Oxbridge Address Convention, Davis wrote, "There should be no context in our society or in our university in which an African American student, professor, or staff member, or any person for that matter, should be asked to call anyone master. There should be no context where male gendered titles should be normalized as markers of authority." Davis's email struck a chord in a campus debate already approaching fever pitch that would become sharper still about race, speech, and tradition at colleges and universities across the country. To that point, the Yale campus debate was largely focused on the propriety of naming a residential college in 1931 in honor of John C. Calhoun. A century prior to 1931, Calhoun was a senator from South Carolina. He was a former U.S. vice president, and he was the foremost advocate for slavery and white supremacy in the U.S. Congress. By the 1930s, however, the prevalent academic views had become sympathetic to Southern resistance to Reconstruction and white supremacy. The so-called Dunning School, significantly at Columbia, but not just at Columbia, had articulated a vision of Reconstruction as one overcoming the freedom and independence of white Southern resistance. By the time, at this very moment, when Yale's chair of Committee on Names and Terminology was announced the Calhoun name, he could assert that Calhoun was the university's most eminent graduate in the field of civil state. I should point out that William Howard Taft, who was also a graduate, had been president of the United States, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and also president of the college, was a candidate also. Part of what's interesting about this is there was no controversy about Calhoun in 1931, about the naming of Calhoun, nor should there have been, given the academic convention at the time. And for other reasons, Calhoun's name may have been put in place in order to encourage enrollment among white men from the South, typically more drawn to Princeton, widely regarded, even before Woodrow Wilson's reign there, as the most Southern of the Northern colleges, while Yale was viewed as the most Yankee college. Selecting the son of the South was pragmatic and maybe even an expedient way of attracting students and donors. And there's some evidence in the archive to suggest that at least was one of the considerations. But by connecting Calhoun College to a man so extricably, the name of the college, Calhoun College to a man so extricably linked with American slavery, Yale's naming committee planted a seed of controversy that would burst through the surface of polite address between students and their masters. None of this was lost on university administrators. In his 2015 welcome address to the incoming class, Yale's president invited those gathered to participate in a year-long discussion of the legacy of slavery reflected in the school's tradition and naming conventions. Of course, a similar conversation was happening here at Georgetown too, and continues. At the time when Davis renounced his title in the fall of 2015, the Council of Masters, there's a group called the Council of Masters, which Davis was actually the head of, had already agreed to discuss the matter in the fall. And I should point out that I have many friends who were on this council and who remain heads of colleges at residential colleges at Yale. They had agreed to discuss the matter in the fall and consider what to do. But by unilaterally and publicly taking the position before that discussion occurred, many felt that Davis preempted the internal conversation. In fact, he simply moved it to a more public forum, where it quickly became apparent that not everybody agreed with his position. Jonathan Holloway, the first African-American dean of the Yale College and former master of Calhoun College, said regarding Davis, his reading of the title is more literal and more focused on our national narrative and naming practices than mine. Nicholas Christakis, whom I'll come back to and whom some of you may have heard relating to another controversy, Nicholas Christakis, master of Silliman College, another residential college, said that he could not think of a better title than master, actually. Anthony Kronman, former dean of the law school at Yale, called Davis's disavowal of the title ill-considered, self-serving, thoughtless, puerile, an act of insufferable arrogance. Abandoning the title and address master was, he argued, a consequence of the coddling demands for political correctness, the enervating spirit of all too ready offense that has deformed our culture, unquote. Now, two separate critiques sound in this charge. First, today's students, encouraged by administrators, are too sensitive, too ready to perceive offense, often where there is none. Second, even if there is actual offense, students and administrators are chilling debate, stifling speech, diminishing our democracy, and encouraging mediocrity. With the first critique, they're too weak, they're too sensitive. With the second critique, they're too powerful, too intolerant. Of course, the two charges are related. Student inability to endure offense, real or imagined, undermines basic values of free expression and critical engagement, not to mention broader cultural tradition, as illustrated in what comes next. As the term went on, and as October's end approached, students received a statement from Yale's Intercultural Affairs Committee, urging them to avoid costumes for Halloween featuring blackface, turbans, American Indian featherhead dresses, and otherwise culturally mocking themes. Questioning the heavy-handedness of the committee's statement, Erica Christakis, who is the spouse of Nicholas, who's the spouse of Nicholas Christakis, and she was also the associate master of Silliman College, wrote, quote, "I wonder, and I'm not trying to be provocative." Whenever somebody says that, they're trying to be provocative. "I wonder, and I'm not trying to be provocative, is there no room anymore for a child or young person to be a little bit obnoxious, a little bit inappropriate or provocative, and yes, offensive? By recognizing an interest in being inappropriate, provocative, or offensive, Christakis was sounding the second charge, arguing for less restrictive speech, less meddling by administrators, and more engaged debate among students. Referring to her husband, her spouse, the head of the master of the college, Christakis shared this advice to upset students. Nicholas says, quote, Nicholas says, if you don't like the costume that someone is wearing, look away, or tell them you're offended. Talk to each other. Simple enough advice to give. And by the way, good advice to give for those who can heed it. Look away or talk it over. It's easier said than done, however, particularly when caught up in the moment of indignation. Note, moreover, that it's the offended party who must make the effort to turn away or to initiate a state of talk about his or her sensitivity to address, not the potential offender, who may bear some burden to change course or think about whether his or her speech or conduct may be the cause of some unintended offense. Yale's Intercultural Affairs Committee, it seems, was attempting to shift the burden onto the latter, while Christakis was seeking to put it onto the former. Now, it may be entirely sensible to place the weight where either party would have it, but it's not obvious where it must land. Whatever balance best struck in a classroom or college residence needn't be the best balance that's in other settings or in society at large, or even in the same academic setting with different participants. To state the entirely obvious, from an abstract perspective, it's an open question whether and when unfettered speech is better than restraint. It's an empirical, open question. Ask anyone who's ever said something he regretted, or someone who failed to say something when she wished she had. But we don't live in abstractions. And even in places of ideas, like universities, concrete realities and interests often intervene in everyday encounters, making the right answer appear all too clear, all too often. Without resolving the question of whether we live in a culture of insensitivity and hypersensitivity that's undermining our contemporary discourse, we can at least acknowledge one bias in the balance between restricted and unrestricted speech that's distinctly American. In such contests, free speech always has a first mover's advantage in the United States, where the creation myth, the nation's creation myth, is significantly founded on the First Amendment, notwithstanding its failure to be incorporated in the original Constitution, nor much of the practice at the time. Compared to the venerated past, to our venerated ancestors, Americans today are simply too sensitive, we're told, including being too sensitive to how they are addressed and how they should address others. This too is a myth. Quote, no American will receive an insulting word, wrote Frances Wright in 1821 after her 2-year tour of the young nation. Wright was a great admirer of the United States, if not all of its institutions, was a formidable person. She recounted the odd sensitiveness of American pride, particularly concerning the address master. She was not the first, nor would she be the last to comment on this feature of American address. In 1805, Richard Parkinson, an English agriculturalist who at one time was employed by George Washington on his farm, wrote, "If you call at the door of any man and ask the servant, 'Is his master at home?' he will say, 'Master, I have no master.'" William Priest, a traveling salesman, similarly recalled following his visit to New York City in the mid-1790s, "If you want to hire a maidservant in the city, she will not allow you the title master, or herself to be called servant." Quote, To speak of their master or mistress is a grievous affront, wrote Charles William Jansen in 1807. Servants, observed John Harriot in 1808, will not allow themselves to be so called, nor will they style their employers as masters or mistress. Household servants were not the only ones who forsaked the title master. Michel Chevalier, the eminent 19th century French economist, noted more generally the American workers' reluctance to make use of the title master. Men and women across America, including shoemakers in Philadelphia, tailors in New York, working men in Charleston, domestics in Cincinnati, all resisted master. European travelers in the late 18th and 19th century found this American sensitivity to the title extraordinary and confusing, to say the least, given the long and honorable usage of the title master going back before medieval times. Jansen viewed the American manner simply as, quote, thin-skinned arrogance, particularly calculated to excite the astonishment of strangers. In her travel book, Wright, counseling foreign visitors to prepare themselves for this particularity among Americans, observed that they will be styled Mr. and Miss, and if they don't make too much of it, things may go smoothly. But if they ask why the epithet master and mistress are dropped, 10 to 1, they will receive for an answer that there are no masters and no servants in America, followed by an indignant and hasty abandonment. Ritual rejection of master is as old as the nation itself. But what accounts for this long-held resistance to this deferential form? Edmund Burke, who was notably sympathetic to the American colonists, suggested a possible answer in another context. Writing in the wake of the French Revolution, Burke observed, "Those who are servants in name, as well as in effect, do not like to be told of their situation, their duty, their obligation." However, there are actually very few complaints in the European travel logs concerning the use of master during the colonial period. It was only in the Revolutionary period and after. Notwithstanding the great number of servants, indentured and otherwise, that then existed on American soil. Moreover, it was not just the servants who rejected the title masters. In New England, in particular, employers were, quote, quite willing to call their servants help or domestics, as the servants were willing to repudiate the title masters. Like man, like master, Americans of all styles, of all stripes, of all stations, following the Revolution, were so touchy and hesitant about the form of address, it seemed to provoke something more than a simple reminder of a worker's status or duty, as Burke suggested. William Priest concluded in 1802 that a republic is not a place to find good servants. The country, of course, was full of able servants, not to mention an embarrassment of slaves. There was no shortage of labor in the servant classes. Priest was not speaking of economic conditions, however. Priest was speaking about Republican ideology. Americans rejected the labels, though not the categories of master and servant, Priest argued, because it was a natural consequence of liberty and equality. And you have to remind me in the question and answer period to talk about the Restatement's third of address, which eliminated master and servant from the Restatements of agency and replaced it with employer and employee. Makes it harder for me to teach fiduciary law because I can't connect it to the history, but it does something distinctive. Even Alexis de Tocqueville agreed with Priest, and as might be expected from de Tocqueville, he offered a subtle analysis. Even in a republic, wrote de Tocqueville, there's still a class of menials and a class of masters. But in America, they are not always composed of the same individuals, still less the same families. Those who command are not more secure of perpetuity than those who obey. Their behavior followed from this perpetual uncertainty of status and position. Among free citizens in America, only serendipity and a contract bound master to servant. There was no fidelity to tradition or role or position or status that connected them in some fixed hierarchical form. And their address reflected this Republican equality. Quote, "Such is the charm of these democratic manners," Tocqueville found, "that even partisans of aristocracy are attracted to it." Well, not everyone was so charmed by the manners of Americans. Frances Trollope was not. Frances Trollope left England in 1827 at the invitation of her friend, Frances Wright, to settle at Wright's anti-slavery experimental colony at Neshoba, Tennessee, not too far from Memphis. Trollope found Neshoba intolerably rough, and she soon left for Cincinnati. Frances Trollope is the mother of the famous English author Anthony Trollope, and there's some very interesting interpretation of Anthony's writing in light of this time when his mother brought them to the frontier, which at the time, the frontier of the country, which at the time was Cincinnati. Trollope found Neshoba intolerably rough and soon left for Cincinnati, where she lived among the local society for a number of years. She discovered that she, quote unquote, detested the extraordinary familiarity of Americans, which she experienced as, quote, a kind of violent intimacy. Servants presented a particular challenge for her, she wrote. The greatest difficulty in organizing a family establishment in Ohio is getting servants, or as they are called, getting help. For it is more than a petty treason to the Republic to call a free citizen a servant, wrote Trollope. Now, Trollope's disparagement of American sensitivities was undoubtedly extreme and surely exaggerated, as much polemic as analysis. William Thackeray once wrote, "She makes up for want of argument by a wonderful fluency of abuse." Still, she was a discerning observer. According to Mark Twain, she was the most perceptive among the foreign visitors to the U.S. at that time, including Tocqueville. And as we've seen, her assessment of this prickly American reaction to servile address was widely shared. Calling men masters left a bitter taste on the tongue of Americans. Observing this fact, however, does not explain its existence. Although maybe we can get a glimpse of it by going back to this encounter of Jansen in 1807. He recalled the occasion where he asked a maid, "Is your master at home?" Her reply was emphatic and revealing. "I have no master," she said. "I am no servant. None but neggers are servants." Race and slavery surely influenced local usage and address. But Americans didn't simply adopt the view that only slaves had masters. They knew better. Whites in colonial America had masters too. Their familiarity with the circumstances of white-bound labor, perhaps even more so than slavery, influenced their disposition towards the addressed master. Chattel slavery of foreign-born or so-called saltwater Negroes, as well as domestic blacks, along with native tribesmen, women, and children enslaved under the laws of conquest or capture, represented only one facet of bound labor in the colonies. Whites were also bound to their masters in servitude through various means, including transportation for felons, indenture, as well as apprenticeships for orphans and imported juveniles, as well as through debt and convict labor. Their numbers were not insignificant. Estimates suggest that 1/2 to 2/3 of all European immigrants to the United States, to the American colonies, arrived as indentured servants. According to Alan Walker Reed, the convict element was larger than American patriotism tends to admit. Absconding and runaway whites sought, like slaves, to escape the conditions of their servitude. Christopher Tomlins and other historians of the American labor movement and American labor during the colonial period have identified the distinct position and treatment of these unfree white workers in court rulings in Connecticut, Delaware, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the Carolinas. In the common parlance of the time and in the opinions that are available to everyone, white servants, in addition to slaves, were well understood to have masters. By denying the address master after the Revolution, free citizens of the new republic sought to distinguish themselves from the broader state of servitude in which they had been limited to, which included, but itself was not limited to slavery. Race and slavery were approximations of forced servitude, but only loosely so, which prompted vigilant rejection of servile address among free citizens, and not only whites. Again, Frances Wright, writing in her travel guide for Europeans, cautioned travelers to the United States to avoid the mistake of believing that Black Americans would be more likely and would more readily bow to servile address than their white counterparts because Blacks constituted a second etat, possessing fewer privileges and consequently less pride than the white community, and therefore may be treated more easily with impunity. Unwary visitors were quickly disabused of this assumption. Wright wrote, "It is not occasionally without feelings of high resentment that Europeans are made sensible to this error. There was even greater imperative among free Blacks to distinguish themselves from their enslaved counterparts by refusing the title master." So how does all of this connect to the controversy involving master at Yale and Princeton and Harvard, which have all now abandoned the title? How does this help us to understand forms of address like that in the 21st century? Over an extended and particular history of slavery and slave-like servitude in America, master acquired a distinct meaning. When forced to choose, Blacks and whites across social classes all rejected master because of this meaning it had and how it stood in relation to Republican ideology. European visitors to the early American Republic failed to grasp the effect of the colonial experience, but contemporary Europeans can look at their own history to appreciate the general phenomenon. An old and familiar common address for leader, Führer, today is unspeakable in Germany, perhaps less so in Austria, because of how that old familiar address became entwined with local history in those particular nations. Master doesn't have the same valence in the US, but it certainly has a distinct ring here. And Davis's rejection of master at Pearson College must be understood in the context of this local history. As late as 1960, the Yale Daily News reported Pearson College had an unofficial mascot was quite literally a slave. The college's weekly publication was called the Pearson Slave. The college each year hosted a Bring a Slave party. The lower court was referred to as the slave quarters until Black students in the 1980s protested this. Moreover, it's not only privileged students that were asked to call Davis and the other college heads masters. It was also the common address that was made and expected by the largely working class black cooks and cleaners and janitors and groundskeepers and other servants working in the university residence halls. It's hardly unimaginable that the speaker and address might have winced in those moments, but continued the pattern of address out of respect for tradition or based on the expectation that others would have thought something odd was going on. Lastly, what about Davis's claim concerning the form of address master as gendered, as a gendered marker of authority? At the time of the controversy, half of the residential college heads were women. They all chose to be addressed as master, not mistress. It's important to know historically that mistress, currently abbreviated Mrs., was silent about marital status. This became a particular phenomenon in the US in the 19th century, where a Mrs. or mistress actually became a marker that one was married, and also interacting to some extent with the doctrine of coverture, the woman's separate identity upon marriage fully disappeared. She became Mrs. John Smith, neither first name nor last name, and nor was there any suggestion that she had any power, because mistress was traditionally defined as a woman having control or authority, a woman with power. A married woman literally lost her power to enter into binding contracts. She had no Hofeldian power in law. Something happened in this period where mistress, and not only mistress, other forms of address for women take on this oddly bivalent quality. Some to some extent representing power, but also sexualized. You see the same thing with madam, and sometimes with the use of address lady. The reason why the women who were masters or heads of colleges chose master and not mistress was not because they were trying to put in place male forms or normalize male forms of authority. It was simply, this is how you wanted, if you wanted to have an exchange where it would be recognized what you were attempting to say and not be confused with a potentially sexualized or other form of expression, you chose master instead of mistress. And this brings us to my final point, and how all of this may come back to forms of address, consideration, and political correctness. I think there are two forms of political correctness, and political correctness takes a substantive and a procedural form. Concerning the procedural form, turning and focusing a little bit on what Lon Fuller had to say about the consideration doctrine. Why do we make people go through these forms in order to enforce a contract? Fuller identified three important reasons. One was an evidentiary function. By going through this particular form, it provides evidence that you actually intended for this promise to be legally enforceable. Fuller also identified a cautionary function by saying that what you are doing at this moment in this particular manner is inviting legal enforcement of your promise, gave caution, gave you a moment of reflection to make sure that that's actually what you wanted to do. And third, Fuller identified a channeling function. There are lots of ways you may make a promise. You may make a gratuitous promise, one that you might want to retract at some point because of ingratuity on the other part, or one that you want to hold binding no matter what. And having consideration as opposed to other donative forms allowed you to channel your intentions. These three forms, these three functions that's served by this form were actually liberty enhancing in the sense that it empowered you to accomplish what you wanted, that you didn't act incautiously, that you acted with evidence and had evidence of your intentions, and that you were able to channel your intentions. There is a way in which political correctness as a form serves exactly these functions. Political correctness as a form doesn't say you can't say what you can't say certain words. It simply says, if you intend to insult someone, you have it. As an American, you have every right to do that. But you should know that this form, if your intention is not to insult, maybe you ought not use this form. Calling any American or expecting any American to address you as master turned out to be a politically incorrect form in the late 1700s and throughout the 1800s, until this odd attempt by Harvard, Princeton, and Yale in the 1930s to import sort of Oxbridge style as a way of inflating their status. It was so contrary to what had been the established American paradigm and approach. That was the perversity, not what had been sort of the sort of natural, almost familiar Republican rejection of that form. Master and servant is politically incorrect and has always been. You could talk to your servant as a visitor to the colonies or to the new republic in any manner you want. You could have a meaningful conversation, but you are not likely to have that conversation if you refer to them as servant and if you expected them to refer to you as master. So political correctness in this form, in this function as form, was a way of channeling your intention. Perhaps you really did intend to put that servant in his place. Perhaps that was your intention. Well, then by all means, call that person a servant and demand your master title, if that's your intention. But if that's not your intention, if what you wanted was a conversation, if what you wanted was to reach across and figure out how we ought to engage, then there are these functional modes of, I'm saying political correctness, but what I'm really talking about are just forms. Forms of address, forms of consideration, forms. Forms facilitate engagement. There is also, I should admit, a substantive aspect to it. There is substantive consideration. And this, I think, gets a little bit more contested. Okay, it's not merely that we ought to address each other civilly, unless, of course, we intend to insult each other, which is we have seen as common in some environments. It's that people are telling us we ought not think or have or advance certain views. Now, the argument for substantive political correctness is weaker, for the same reason why the argument for substantive consideration is weaker. Law doesn't look to how fair the exchange is for the most part. The court doesn't consider the equivalence of the exchange for the most part, as long as the forms are present. However, the court does have boundaries. A peppercorn, a substance that will not support a binding agreement. And courts will look when the exchange is too outlandish and say it is unconscionable. It is unconscionable and will not enforce that. And there are elements of substantive political correctness that we agree on today that we didn't agree on in the past. Today we agree that slavery was wrong. That was politically contestable before and after the Civil War. Today we agree that segregated schools, segregated neighborhoods are wrong. That was politically contestable within all of our generations. Today we agree that laws against interracial marriage are politically incorrect. That was contestable. Today we agree, I think, and we're moving same-sex marriage. prohibiting same-sex unions and marriage is wrong. That was substantively, politically contestable. It's now politically, so there's a substance too. And these things interact. The possibility of channeling and focusing and engaging through the forms actually allows the conversations that bring us to the substance. I don't know what the substance of the next conventions that are deeply politically correct that we all agree on are. But I find it so problematic, the easy way in which political correctness, for all the good that it does for our community, for all the good that it does for getting us engaged with each other, is rejected. Fuller has a nice sort of final point. I'll just quote some of it. As a final and various obvious point to the comparison between forms of law and those of language, we may observe that in both fields, the actual course of history is determined by a continuous process of compromise between those who wish to preserve the existing patterns and those who wish to rearrange them. The mere fact that the form of law and language, or the forms of law and language, are set by a balance of opposing tensions does not, of course, ensure the soundness of the developments will actually occur. If language sometimes loses valuable distinctions by being too tolerant, the law has lost valuable institutions like the seal by being too liberal or interpreting them too liberally. On the other hand, in law, as in language, forms have at times have been allowed to crystallize to the point where they need innovation, where the need for innovation has been impeded. So sometimes our language gets too fixed. And I do want to acknowledge that point. But sometimes the fixed structure of our language invites exactly the kind of discourse, polite, civil, politically correct discourse that's about form and process that may get us to a better and more useful and constitutive substantive outcomes. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
Is it on? Yeah. All right. My name is Malefi. I'm a tax LLM here at Georgetown. I wanted to thank you for your remarks and say that they were especially timely for me just in my personal conversations with my friends in light of Dr. Ben Carson's comments 2 days ago where he seemed to conflate slavery with immigration. But in light of yours, I had to write it down because in light of your suggestion that Master may have been equally or comparably offensive to whites and blacks during the revolutionary period, was there some substance to former Master Davis's choice to justify his 2015 disavowal of the term of address master by stating that no black student should have to use the term? Or was he being politically correct? Or was he just unaware of the pervasiveness and extent of the forced bondage of white people, which, as you asserted, may have affected up to 2/3 of European immigrants?
That's a terrific question, and I too am puzzling about the comment by Dr. Carson concerning Stephen Davis. I do think that there was something distinctive about race at that moment, black students in particular, and I really can't emphasize to you enough. And I don't know if you've experienced this in your own institutions, and it's kind of a complicated feature of universities in urban settings, where so much of the servant staff are black. I go to Wash U, and it's not just in the South, it's in New Haven, and it's hard to disconnect race from that. And I think for Davis, seeing these dignified adult black men and women calling him master was too much. When I point to the historical resistance of master among white, sort of the new citizens of the Republic, I was speaking more to their own history and their own sort of sensibilities about having been quite literally servants who were masters. The whites, unfree white labor at this time was not equivalent. And I don't mean to create an equivalence between indentured servitude and slavery, but the experience that many of these people were, these white people who were rejecting the title master and also rejecting being called servant, the experience that they were appealing to was not a vicarious experience of slaves. It was often a direct experience of themselves or their own families having been in indentured servitude for many generations. So I think there's just to answer your point more precisely, I think there is when Stephen Davis rejected the title master in 2015, there was definitely something about its relationship to African Americans being asked to use that form of address, as well as, of course, there's the gendered element, which I didn't go into. It was quite salient.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
And there was a point that you wanted us to remind you to address in Q&A.
Yeah.
That's where I'm going.
Yeah, this is so it's related. So
I'm Philip Schrag. I'm a member of the faculty here. And your comment reminded me that when I was in law school in the 1960s, it wasn't just the restatement, but Amjur and Corpus Juris and West Publishing Company and all of the books referred to the law of master and servant. And that struck me at the time as really weird because that wasn't the way people talked in ordinary language. So how did this enter the law as the definitive category for agency and labor law?
Yeah. So Christopher Tomlin has I think the definitive book tracing the usage of servants, the law of servants, into employment law presently, and it actually follows pretty steadily throughout. It wasn't until Deborah Threedy, who is the reporter for Restatement's third of agency, and I suppose now the new restatement of employment will follow her lead. It wasn't until she did that there was a definitive statement that we are rejecting the title master and servant. I'm teaching the basic corporations class this year, and if you read the current cases that we're dealing with franchise agreements, and it's all in terms of masters and servants, and whether or not this is an independent servant or a servant that's controlled. And responding superior in tort is all based on the notion of the master is liable for the harms committed by the servant that's controlled. So there's element of control, but it runs throughout. And the point I wanted to bring up, so at first I thought it would be difficult for me. Now that Deborah has sort of changed the language in restatements, how am I going to make this history? So I think you have to appreciate the role of the law and the way it's working today. You have to be able to connect it to literally what the history of servants, and although there's a common law distinction, much of the common law incorporates the Roman law treatment where the master was the head of the household and was liable for all of the harms committed and contracts committed by slaves, servants, adult children, and wives, as well as minor children, of course. So how do you understand that organizational household structure of masters and servants, and related to modern theories of the firm and the law regulating corporations without the language So I thought I was going to be humbled or at least undermined and it turns out that it was just as you said. It was the old language was bizarre, and everybody now understands employer-employee much better. And this, I suppose, this is some of what Fuller was talking about. That, those who have facility with the forms, either in law or in language, and they use it in certain ways, they fight to retain it, even when retaining it serves no present good, and might actually just be creating and facilitating continued forms of hierarchy and subordination. There's just no reason to have, because you can be an employee and outside of the scope of employment, then you could be on an equal basis with this person who's your employer. But once you switch to master and servant, it doesn't move so easily. It's a more fixed status, even as you move across domains. So there are lots of reasons to be. My own experience with it sort of made it clear that one should really be vigilant and careful in the languages and the uses we deploy as familiar ways, as if it's the only way of making sense of certain forms.
The American categories go all the way back to Roman law, to British law.
Yes. Yeah. And in Holmes's common law, he actually does a nice job of tracing it back to the British law. But a lot of it sort of goes back to Roman law. Some of it gets imported. The British pretend it's all English common law, but a lot of it gets imported when the French and the Norman invasion. But there is something distinctive going on there with sort of English common law. But it has a long tradition.
Hi, my name is Alvaro Santos. I'm a member of the faculty here, and I really enjoy your thought-provoking lecture. I particularly love the way you tied speech to legal form and to this historical account you gave us. I want to suggest there's a challenge to political correctness, even though I agree by and large with your position, and that is that it might mask underlying social relations that of asymmetry, of power, of hierarchy, that we might then tend to ignore because we've grown accustomed to a particular usage that suggests that those relations don't exist anymore. Yeah. And so in your historical account, I thought it was really fascinating how in the New Republic in the United States, people refuse the term master or servant, even though in effect they had a relationship of master and servant, and that was the observation of the foreigners and even of some of the locals, right? Yeah. And so that there's an insistence in not using the term, and that might create a make-believe that, in fact, that relationship has faded away when it exists. Yeah. To take a current example, you said, when referring to substance, that segregation was no longer palatable or accepted socially, that there was a consensus now, in education at least, that segregation had no place in American society. However, American schools are largely segregated, which might suggest that, in fact, the American society thinks it's a good idea. And so how do you reconcile, and I know that probably that's not true, but how do you reconcile that with the material conditions that give rise to these relations? Poking political correctness might also give a jolt or show that there are relations that are problematic and that need to be addressed rather than ignoring them.
Oh, that's a wonderful point. And that really, I was sort of looking for some comments that I had on this, but just very quickly, I completely agree. I think there are ways in which the forms, especially when they become polite and acceptable, might actually conceal much of the not so polite. and not so acceptable forms of abuses that exist. That these mechanisms of address and engagement can really perpetuate in very destructive ways forms of subordination and hierarchy that ought to be challenged. And sometimes that calls for moments of incivility. Sometimes that calls for moments of clashes in order to get to the other side. And there's no clear, I have no clear intuition for that. Other than this is the constant balance, what's the fuller term, the constant tension of opposing forces. I actually think the tension is useful. I think it helps us to challenge what is political. By the way, political correctness, it was a term first used by the feminist movement, not by the conservative movement. It was a term that radical feminists were using against more conventional feminists, saying that you are considering only white middle-class women in your feminist arguments, and you're only focused on this politically correct group, whereas you should be more inclusive. You should think about more. So even the challenge and the way we think about sort of political correctness as a form of inclusion is unsettled and maybe really ought to be in some basic way. I know that's not a very clear answer. So a really wonderful question, and if we can talk more. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Patrice Howard. I'm a first-year evening student.
Hi, Patrice.
Professor Brooks, thank you for your remarks. My question is in two parts, particularly related to the several forms that I take on. So in the spirit of International Working Women's Day,
Yes.
as a biologically sexual woman, I wanted to ask you about the sources of the female writers that you referenced during the remark. I found it fascinating. I hadn't heard of them before. My second question is sort of related to that, and it's in an exercise to push your remarks both further and deeper. And you mentioned that the female heads of colleges sort of eschewed the term mistress. And it's this eschewing activity that my question sort of centers on. Because I think the intent in political incorrectness that we're all observing in this particular time is partly related to the idea that a person's existence or being is politically incorrect. And so political incorrectness is an intentional demonstration of that belief that someone's existence, like an unmarried female with power, should be completely eschewed and not recognized. And so my question is to push you further and deeper and ask you, what is the language-based contractual solution that you might have to that interchange?
Oh, that's great. So, I should mention, so the female, Frances Wright and Frances Trollope, they are incredibly fascinating. And there are many, and I chose those two because they had written travel logs, and I was interested in sort of how these European visitors were sort of thinking about these very observant European visitors were thinking about American culture at this time. But there are many other women writers at this time that are saying important things, and I can send you some of the other sources I didn't discuss. And so, in terms of the empowerment of the form of address, I also want to mention that sometimes the address only does some of it. I have a general theory about forms of address really just solving. I'm sort of an applied game theorist, and I think about social interaction as ways of coordinating behavior. And there are just a gazillion ways we can coordinate our behavior. And we're constantly trying to avoid unnecessary clashes. Sometimes clashes are necessary and useful, but for the most part, we're trying to avoid that. And something that happens across all societies is that often people address each other. And I think that address, that initial address, is a signal around which people coordinate themselves. And that signal can coordinate in ways that actually perpetuate, it avoids clashes, but it might perpetuate bad outcomes when clashes would be useful. So when I think about sort of gendered address too, I imagine that this could be one way of overcoming it and this type of coordination failure. And I had this theory, I used this example of, there's a reason why when coordination really matters, that's when you're going to get these forms of address. So there was a study done during the Vietnam War of soldiers in the field. And these soldiers and their commanders, they were largely the same age, 19 and 20. And when they were out in the field, they basically went on a first name basis of referring to each other, John and Bill and Bob. When they were under fire, when bombs were coming in, they switched from first names and they became captain and sir. They started using the forms of address rather than the familiar first name address. And my argument was, when coordination is essential, when it really matters that the hierarchy is established, and it doesn't have to be hierarchy. It could be that the solidarity is what matters. During the French Revolution, everyone becomes citoyen. They're all citizens. During the Russian Revolution, they're all comrades. Whether it's hierarchy or solidarity, during these moments of crisis, are you giving me an order that I should follow? Are you with me? Are we doing this jointly? Coordination does a lot of work, and address is doing a lot of that work. That was my general theory, and then I had the example of a surgeon in the operating room is going to get that title. A judge in her courtroom is going to get that title. A professor in the classroom will get that title. And as you move further away, as you move from the operating room to the hospital, or from the courtroom to the courthouse, or from the classroom to the campus, maybe you'll get it. Maybe you'll also get the title. But at that point, it's not serving any great coordination function. Maybe it's just some type of illegitimate deference. And as you move outside of the courthouse into a shopping mall, why should the professor, doctor, or lawyer, is there any legitimate sort of in terms of coordination? So that was the theory I was spinning. In emergency, it'll pop up. And then there was this account. It's somewhat pervasive in the press, and just this past fall, of these black women, doctors, who were on airplanes, and passengers were like in trouble, suffering heart attacks or seizures, and they would run up and say, "I'm a doctor." Oh, that's where the coordination should happen. And they were not allowed to look at the passenger. They were questioned about their authority. Are you a real doctor? I was stunned. It was completely contrary to the theory I'd been spinning about how address, when it really matters, when it's, when life is on the line, and you issue the address, people will step out of your way and let you save someone's life. So there's more that's going on than just address. Gender and other forms, parents, skin color, all of these things. We're constantly trying to coordinate, and we live in a world of massive indeterminacy about what should happen next. And address helps us to fix some of that. But there's a lot of other junk for historical reasons that are also telling us what should happen next whenever we coordinate or interact with other people. So what's the best way going forward? I actually think there are a couple of colleges, residential colleges in England, at Oxford and Cambridge, one at Cambridge, where the head of the college is referred to as mistress. Those colleges started off as all women's colleges and have subsequently admitted men. None have yet had a male head of college. And I don't know if that male head of college will take on mistress of the college or master. I suspect master. But the fact of the matter is that there is authority that rests with master, authority that is unambiguous in a way that the authority that once, a very long time ago, a couple hundred years ago, rested with mistress unambiguously as a woman of power. That we no longer have that. So it's not clear that we can go back to that. It's not clear that that's the easiest path. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.